Thousands of demonstrators tried to storm the National Assembly building in Quito, Ecuador. The U.S. auto giant General Motors temporarily lays off over 400 workers in Mexico because of the strike by its workers in the U.S. And the search continues for missing African migrants in the Mediterranean Sea following a shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa. This is From the South. I am Doris Polo. We begin in Ecuador, where thousands of demonstrators have been trying to storm the National Assembly building in Quito. This is the 6th day of protests against the government's austerity package, which includes a sharp rise in fuel prices. Protesters broke through the barricades outside the assembly. The police have been trying to drive them back from the building itself. Large indigenous marches from the northern and central highlands have converged on the capital, where they have been joined by students, trade unions, and many other social movements and ordinary citizens angry at the economic measures. Our correspondent Estefania Bravo is at the assembly here in Quito and just sent us this report.
Hello, yes, thank you. We are here in the north of Quito in 6 de Diciembre, Itarqui. And as you can see, the indigenous movements have come out to the streets to protest against the economic measures imposed by President Lenín Moreno. This is the 6th day. We are very close to the National Assembly, so mobilizations here continue. Indigenous movements say they want to take over the National Assembly. They are very close. They are protesting peacefully. They are against the economic measures imposed by President Lenín Moreno. We can also confirm that the Wambra community outlet has confirmed the death of 1 person. So that would mean 2 people that have died in these protests. The indigenous movements are asking that the executive order eliminating the subsidies of the gasoline be eliminated so that the gasoline prices doesn't rise, because they say it affects them, it affects their family. So we will continue to be here with the team of Telesur, and we will give you an update as soon as we have it.
Protests have been ongoing since last Thursday. In light of the mobilizations, President Moreno moved his government to Guayaquil. State institutions suspended most activities on Tuesday as schools remain closed for a 4th day. The authorities have also announced that 570 people have been detained so far as social media continues to be flooded with images of police brutality.
Seems like something must have kicked off.
Now, as the first indigenous marchers from the south, along with other protesters, arrived in the historic center of Quito on Monday night, the police met them with volleys of tear gas. Some demonstrators responded with stones, but the police soon cleared the Santo Domingo Square with more tear gas and officers on horseback. Indigenous marchers from the northern highlands got a very different reception when they reached the low-income neighborhood of Calderón in the north of Quito. They were cheered by local residents who had collected food and other supplies for them. And after the repression in the center of the city, the indigenous protesters from the south were also given a meal by social movements who turned out to welcome them. Indigenous marchers have continued to arrive in the capital on Tuesday morning. Thousands made their way through the community of Carcelén on the northern edge of Quito. They were heading for the center to join those already there. Staying in Ecuador, President Lenín Moreno gave a televised address late on Monday to announce he has transferred the seat of government to the city of Guayaquil after having abandoned the capital, Quito. He went on to assert that reported incidents of violence indicate the protests are organized in order to bring down his administration.
Countrymen, I've moved to the city of Guayaquil, and I've also transferred the seat of government to the city in accordance with the Constitution. I've always put the peace and tranquility of Ecuadorians before my own well-being. What's happened over these days in Ecuador isn't a protest of discontent because of a government decision. The violence, vandalism, and looting shows that here there is an organized political effort to destabilize the government and an end to constitutional and democratic order.
Indigenous protesters have also arrived in the city of Guayaquil, the financial hub of Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno has holed himself up. In response to this, the roads leading to the city's wealthiest neighborhood have been blocked by authorities. This as Guayaquil has also been rocked by anti-government protests in recent days.
As we didn't have any official information and the indigenous marches were coming from the highlands and there are several entrances to Guayaquil, we didn't know where they would arrive. So we protesters from the Recreo and Duran came here to the bridge. People knocked down the lampposts to block the road to cars. The police, as usual, used force, fired tear gas to stop us from moving forward and blocking the road.
Let's hear from our correspondent in Guayaquil, Carla Gonzalez.
So we are still at the National Unity Bridge connecting Duran and Guayaquil. We are witnessing how people are starting to get a bit exacerbated. The movement of the troops, the Air Force, the military, the municipal trucks that have come here to block the entrance of the national strike, trying to enter Guayaquil, has turned people here in Duran a bit uncomfortable with their presence, so they are starting to gather around to protest, to block also the main road here. We are looking at how municipal trucks have entered since yesterday, trying to block the entrance of more protests that are trying to enter the city, and tomorrow they have planned a national strike that will see also several indigenous communities entering Quito and Guayaquil, the main cities in the country.
That was our correspondent Carla Gonzalez with that report. Shifting gears now, Colombia's former president Álvaro Uribe is being questioned by the Supreme Court over alleged witness tampering. Protesters gathered outside the court ahead of the hearing. They say Uribe, as a senator and the unofficial head of the governing party, is partly responsible for the murder of hundreds of community leaders and former FARC guerrillas. The case against the former president has to do with his alleged involvement with right-wing paramilitaries.
I never thought that frankly defending honor in my love for Colombia, with respect for citizens, and in accordance with the Constitution, would create these judicial difficulties for me.
Our correspondent Hernán Tobar is outside the Supreme Court in Bogotá.
We are outside the court where the senator and former president Álvaro Uribe arrived a short while ago. I'll let the camera show you what's happening here. There are groups of human rights activists, groups of Uribe supporters, but above all, people who are demanding justice and that Senator Uribe be investigated, not only for his links with paramilitaries, but also for his connection with the so-called false positives, where civilians were kidnapped and murdered by the army and then presented as guerrillas killed in combat. Senator Uribe was originally called to appear at a courtroom in the north of the capital, but for security reasons, the police said they had to move the hearing to the main Supreme Court building here, in the center of Bogotá. Senator Uribe was called to answer a list of 100 questions presented by the judges relating to the accusation that he tampered with witnesses and manipulated evidence.
Staying in Colombia, a bill promoted by right-wing parties proposes setting limits on public protests. Human rights organizations are opposing the bill as it violates constitutional and international norms.
Demonstrations like this are a target of security bodies belonging to the Colombian government. The defense minister and the interior minister agree that social movements must be regulated by means of a bill that will be presented by right-wing political parties in Congress and that aims at setting limits on public demonstrations.
We need to create punitive measures for social protests because the way public forces are attacked isn't appreciated by citizens. Civil servants are ridiculed. In some cases, they try to set them on fire and attack them with all kinds of tools, and in some cases with firearms. This requires punitive measures.
Human rights organizations argue that if this project were to be adopted, it would be violating Colombia's political constitution. They say the bill is actually seeking to provide ways to violently suppress all sorts of protests, as well as stigmatize social movements that are growing in the country.
If we are going to talk about building a constitutional norm or any other kind of norm about protest, it must be one that guarantees protests can take place and that they are not limited or criminalized, and one that doesn't promote police violence.
One of the most controversial aspects of this project is the possibility that under the presumption of acts of violence or vandalism, public forces may force their way into educational institutions, something that, according to the educational community, violates the principle of university autonomy. Meanwhile, the students' community is also demanding investigations into the anti-riot squad after the death of students during protests.
The student movements have specifically had to endure many murders. At the hands of the SMAD, student leaders like in the case of Oscar Salas, who was murdered inside this university by a non-conventional weapon used by the SMAD during a confrontation.
In the next days, the project aiming at regulating demonstrations in Colombia will be presented in Congress for debate and approval. Meanwhile, students have been protesting, saying that on October 10th, they will mobilize on the streets to request the abolishment of the anti-riot squad and the investigation of acts of corruption inside public universities.
We'll take a short break now. When we come back, Trinidad and Tobago's government presents a $53 billion TT dollar budget. We'll have details after this. Welcome back. The U.S. auto giant General Motors is temporarily laying off another 446 workers in Mexico because of the strike by its workers in the United States. Last week, GM suspended 6,000 workers at its Silao assembly and transmission plant in Guanajuato in central Mexico. The latest layoffs are its engine plant in Ramon Arizpe. 48,000 members of the United Auto Workers Union went on strike across the United States on September 16th. Talks with management are said to be deadlocked. Our correspondent in Mexico City, Eduardo Martinez, has the details.
According to the latest update, about 446 General Motors workers in Mexico have been fired as a result of a strike by workers from the same company in the United States, which has been going on for a month by now. The majority of workers are deployed at the company's Ramos Arizpe factory in the north of Mexico. GM previously laid off 6,000 workers in Mexico at a separate facility in Silao, Mexico. Of the workers in Mexico are obliged to take out vacations, and they will only receive 55% of their salaries during this time. The GM strike in the U.S. affects about 6,000 GM workers in Mexico. Car components make up one of the biggest portions of Mexico's export market. The Mexican government hasn't taken address the worker situation so far.
With a general election due next year, Trinidad and Tobago's government has presented what many are calling a sweetheart budget. The $53 billion TT dollar fiscal package was delivered by Finance Minister Colm Imber on Monday. He announced an increase in the minimum wage from $15 to $17.50 per hour, starting from December 2019. Persons employed in state community enhancement programs also got a 15% pay hike. Farming will become a tax-free industry, with all fees and duties on all inputs for farmers to be removed, and a ban on the importation of styrofoam in the food industry and the use of plastic water bottles in government offices will take effect at the start of 2020.
I now propose that daily paid workers in the public service with an appropriate minimum length of service be eligible for the minimum public service pension of $3,500 per month. I propose to offer, in the first instance, $3 billion in interest-bearing government bonds.
And the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce has mixed reactions to the budget. While the powerful business lobby is pleased with most of the budgetary measures, it is concerned about the government's failure to put a cap on crime, which continues to be a major deterrent to business activity in TNT.
While we have seen positive elements since the Commissioner Guy Griffith assumed his position, there is still a perception that Trinidad and Tobago is not a safe country. This is mainly due to the high murder rate that currently exists. Allocations in the national security has been increased over time. However, crime does not seem to be declining. The Minister announced the purchase of several pieces of equipment to expand the operational plan to fight crime. If we want to see improved foreign investment, we must see positive results on these initiatives, as companies want a safe country to invest and operate.
Because Prime Minister Island threat of climate change. He made the comment while giving the keynote address at the GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference in Incheon, South Korea on Monday. PM Holness drove home the point that more must be done to tackle the crisis.
Climate-related shocks, whether sharp and swift hurricanes or lingering and debilitating droughts, have a long-term effect, particularly on the economic growth trajectory and public debt of small island developing states and less developed countries. The problem is compounded by the fact, as you all know, small island developing states, notwithstanding that by virtue of size, we are the least cause of the problem. By virtue of our geography, we are among the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. But we are also, by virtue of the state of development of our economy and public institutions, we are amongst the least to respond.
Shift and social force. The resignation of President El Chapo Guzman gave $1 million to the brother of the Honduran president, a bribe that was meant to reach the country's leader for campaign financing.
President Hernandez, who enjoys the staunch support of the Trump administration, has said the accusations were less serious than Alice in Wonderland. But prosecutors in New York tell a different story. They allege that El Chapo personally gave the money in bribes to Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, the president's brother, who in turn used his government connections to smuggle U.S.-bound cocaine through Honduras.
It's devastating for a country when its president is being accused of scheming against an entire institutional structure that allowed drug trafficking to take place from South to North of America.
After the first hearings against Tony Hernandez, Honduras Attorney General and the Supreme Court have failed to say whether any investigation would be launched into the allegations against the Honduran president and his brother.
There has been no answer from the state attorneys so far. There are no answers neither from the armed forces nor the police. They're just silent. This is what's happening right now in the country, and it's so unfortunate because the Honduran people are the ones who are suffering.
Various opposition forces are starting to mobilize. And now they are calling for mass protest action to demand the resignation of Juan Orlando Hernandez and his co-conspirators.
As a result of this, opposing political and social forces are calling for the people to exercise their right to protest. Until the narco dictatorship falls down, we will let you know the details in time.
Interest from various social and political sectors have been mobilizing to hold mass protests against Juan Orlando Hernandez's government.
There's been major uncertainty in our country. The entire opposition needs to join forces. We can't have a leader that's been accused of drug trafficking by the New York Southern District Attorney. I believe that Juan Orlando Hernandez's resignation is crucial for the entire country.
The president has been labeled a co-conspirator, though he has not been charged. During the trial against his brother, former mayor Alexander Ardón testified that the president received funds that facilitated drug trafficking, while providing protection to Ardón and his family.
Now, let's go live to our correspondent, Estefania Bravo, who is at the assembly here in Quito, Ecuador, to give us the latest updates on the situation. Hello, Estefania, tell us what is going on out there.
Hi, Doris. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, we are here in 12 de Octubre Avenue, and as you can tell, various indigenous movements have come very close to the assembly, and they want to get as close as possible. They are rejecting the economic measures imposed by President Lenin Moreno, specifically the elimination of the subsidy of gasoline. They say that this is going to hurt their family, it's going to hurt them. And yes, we can also see police repression here. The indigenous movements have come here to protest peacefully, but the police and military have not responded peacefully. We have felt and we have seen how how they have thrown gas, smoke gas, and yes, it is a very tense situation here. There's not a lot of local press here, only, as far as I can see, only Telesur is here, and people just, they are not here to protest violently. All they want is for the president to listen to them and for the president to eliminate the executive decree that says that the gasoline subsidy will be eliminated. We know that President Lenin Moreno is currently in Guayaquil with all his cabinet, and that is also a little bit, that also angers the people because they want to meet President Moreno, but he is currently not here. We are expected to have he is expected to give a press conference in the next coming hours, but no official has met with these indigenous leaders. So they are not able to meet with officials. As you can see right now, the situation here is tense because of the police repression against the indigenous movement stories.
Estefania, we are receiving reports that some indigenous members have met with officials in the National Assembly. Can you confirm or deny this?
I am not sure about that. Through social media, I have not seen that. I don't know if that's official. But I am outside of the National Assembly, and to get to the Assembly is very hard. As you can see, there is a police barricade there, also a military barricade, so it's really hard to get in. What social movements here and indigenous movements want to do is to get closer to talk to them. I'm not sure if the meeting that you have mentioned is happening. In the next coming hours, I can confirm that.
We are also hearing that the opposition radio station Pichincha Universal has been raided by the police. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that I can confirm. Our correspondent Orlando Perez is there, and he has confirmed that police has raided Pichincha Universal. Let's recall that Pichincha Universal is an opposition radio against the current president Lenin Moreno, and he said that this had been planned for a long time. It's not something that happened just overnight. They were planning this. Their signal, I think, is down. So yes, I can confirm that, and our correspondent Orlando Perez is there also.
And finally, how does all of this fit into the plans for a national strike tomorrow?
Yes, as you mentioned, there is a nationwide strike that is planned tomorrow. Various indigenous movements have come from all over the country. We're talking about Guayaquil, Quito, Riobamba, various cities to protest against the economic measures imposed by Lenin Moreno. As I mentioned, what they are against is the elimination of the gasoline subsidies that they say is affecting not only the transportation sector because the transportation will be more expensive, but also they work in agriculture, so the agriculture sector will also be affected. So there is a massive strike, a nationwide strike that is going to happen tomorrow. Various social movements, including the indigenous, students, workers, will meet tomorrow, and yeah, we will see what happens tomorrow. But as you can tell, things are not okay here in Quito. It's very tense.
Thank you so much, Estefania, for bringing us that report. That was our correspondent, Estefania Bravo, at the National Assembly here in Quito, bringing us live an update on what is taking place there as protesters are trying to reach the Assembly to get word from officials. Coming up, officials in Hong Kong say protests have reached critical levels. We have more on this and other stories after the break.